Hello, everybody. I'm Jamie Druckmann, a political science professor and associate director of IPR. Welcome everybody in person and online. It's my pleasure to introduce Eli Finkel. To give you a sense of Eli, I want you to imagine something. Imagine that you studied something for 15 years. You've become widely recognized world expert on it. You wrote a best-selling book on it. What would you do? Well, most of us would probably extend that work or find something that's related to that work and go in that direction. Imagine if instead you decided to pursue a completely different research agenda about which you'd read very little. I assume like you, that sounds pretty overwhelming. Then imagine that 3 years later, you also were the lead author on a paper on this topic in Science. That's exactly what Eli did, and he did so while continuing to publish at a remarkable pace on his initial interest, which is the science of relationships. So on that topic, Eli has published what looks like more than, I couldn't count, I just ran out of time to keep counting, but it looks like well over 100 highly impactful papers, received millions of dollars in grant funding, received many awards, including notably the Early Career Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and the very prestigious George Miller Award from the APA for an article published in the Psychology Review. He's also done extremely important work on research methods and epistemology, and he's co-edited 3 books. He's also currently a co-editor of the very famous Handbook of Social Psychology, and this will be the 6th edition. So I think lots of us know about the history of that volume. He has appointments in Kellogg's and psychology and is an IPR associate. And he's also a celebrated teacher, having won the Koldyke Outstanding Teacher Professorship. And those of you who know Eli won't be surprised that he also won the Most Spirited Professor Award. Circling back to the research shift that I mentioned, it was perhaps one of the most fortunate turns of my career is to work with Eli on this new topic, which is political polarization. The main challenge in working with Eli working on Eli is keeping up with the pace at which his mind processes things. He has a remarkable ability to work through ideas, synthesize them, and generate novel insights, yet he doesn't lose sight of the details. In fact, I can tell you I spent 5 hours or so on a phone call with Eli talking about one sentence. I don't know if you remember that phone call. So, I suppose those are the unique attributes one needs to pick up a new research agenda. And that's what he's going to talk about today, which is fighting phantoms, disagreement versus disdain in the American body politic.
Thank you. You don't need me to tell you that Jamie is too generous. Can I get a thumbs up? Do you guys know that? Well, how do I even see if you can hear me? Let me know if you can't, let somebody know if you can't see this online. Okay, I am delighted to be here. This is a talk that's about science. It's also me trying to play with an idea. Good, thank you. It's my effort to try to wrap my head around what is, as Jamie just mentioned, a really new and sort of terrifying space for me. So let me start with what is my working background thesis in this space right now. All of what I'm about to tell you requires like vastly more time and evidence that I'm going to be able to give you today. But this is my like working thesis. This is sort of how I'm thinking about these things these days. American politics are in a partisan death spiral rooted in delusion, and no fix is viable unless we, the people, prioritize democratic means over partisan ends. All of that requires a lot of unpacking. I'm not going to do all that today, but I'm going to share some of my thoughts that is, I think amounts to some of the pieces of evidence that I think amount to or lead into this thesis. I hope to be back again at some point and elaborate. But broadly speaking, there's a little bit of like where from here, right? So I'll get into what is concerning me in a little bit, but broadly, for all of us, when we think about, well, what makes sense? Like, what's the right way to think about what's happening with our political system over the last certainly 5-10 years, but perhaps even longer than that? Like, what are the possibilities? And if you are willing to go along with me with the assumption that we're on a bad road, you know, what are the offerings, right? And there's a bunch here, but there's a few options. One is electoral victory. One side just wins in the marketplace of ideas and wins at the ballot box. And this is the way the system is supposed to work. For reasons I'll talk about in a bit, I'm pretty skeptical that this is going to happen on any imminent time horizon. Another is undemocratic conquest, so violence or some other form of anti-democratic chicanery to try to win despite actually not winning in any legitimate sort of way. I'm much more optimistic that this will happen than that this will happen, but also horrified. And there is, like, broadly speaking, and I'll end up here, you guys may or may not agree, like there might be better ways to do this, and maybe this is legit in your arguments, and I'd like to hear arguments in favor of this over one of the alternatives. Some of you might have some, and there may be compelling arguments, but for me, this trial by discussion or what we might call what is it, deliberative democracy, but we're getting kind of close to my world, right? So how is it that members of a union, let's call it the United States, but you could also talk in terms of a marriage being a union, how is it that we deal with toxic disagreement, with hatred and venom, with totally incompatible stories about what's happened in the union and what the future holds? And so here's me just taking a quick note to say you must buy this book, like not just one copy, as many copies as you can afford. So I bring this up in part because this like trial by discussion idea is sort of the essence of how we think about how relationships function well. I study other things in this space, including like sexual desire and so forth. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about like we're fighting. What are we fighting about? What's the root of the fighting? And how could we potentially get beyond the fighting to a healthier place, right? And literally like a lot of what we do is deal with, well, things are really toxic right now. Does it have to end? What are the prospects? And sometimes there really are prospects going forward. And that's part of the reason why I'm not completely pessimistic about our political union. But there's a second reason why I bring up this slide, other than have you purchased it yet, which is I want to say this is to a large extent, this is a book about expectations. This is a book that's about like, what should we ask of the marriage? Lots of people saying we're asking too much. We need to stop doing that. That had initially been my thesis when I set out to write the book. It is not the thesis that I had by the time I concluded the book. And I just want to show you, like as I was writing the book, I was sort of near the end, and over a lunch break, I was checking Twitter. This is, again, a 2017 book. I think this was May of 2016. So I was in the finishing stages of the first draft. And I saw this tweet. This is from the Gottman Institute. John Gottman, if you know the name, is one of the leading experts in the field of marriage research, who says couples who are demanding of their marriage are more likely to have deeply satisfying unions than couples who lower their expectations. So don't half-ass it. Go in and demand a lot and expect a lot, and that's good. Literally a matter of minutes later, same lunch break, Esther Perel, one of the other leading thinkers in this space, says expectations are resentments waiting to happen. And so this book is to a significant extent my attempt to reconcile that. Like, which one of them is right? But really, they're both kind of right. And I'm not going to go into that here. It's a different talk. But my take in general is we can ask whatever we want of our marriage. I'm not going to tell people, like, don't ask so much. There's upsides to asking a lot, but there are consequences of those asks. If you want your marriage to be your best friend, and to have lifelong monogamy for 60 years and make sure that it's sexually fulfilling. Like there's all sorts of things you're welcome to ask, but to just be like, no, I'm just asking, and then expect that the marriage is just going to deliver those things, that's a bad idea. And so this is one of the key themes from my interest in the relationship space. You'll see that come back soon as I tilt over to the politics space. So without further ado, the outline for today's talk is, first, I'll talk a little bit about democracy in America, sort of a modest topic. I'll talk about the sense in which I think we're divided. I'm not going to get into it today, but I'm now convinced that polarization is basically a misnomer in almost every meaning of the term. I'll talk about what I think is actually happening with the schisms in our nation. Why not violence? Here I'm going to make a full-throated argument in favor of violence. And then I will then make a full-throated argument against it that is basically rooted in the idea that we are fundamentally deluded in the way we think about these things. By the way, too bad I didn't get a chance to introduce you, Jamie, because you're my inspiration for a lot of these ideas. Okay, and then finally, we'll draw a conclusion where I'll convince you to buy more copies of my book. Okay, so democracy in America. So again, this is part of my my abstract, right? And I find this stuff interesting. One of the most famous anecdotes, my best reading is that some version of this probably did happen. There's contemporaneous evidence from 1787. I don't know for sure. The historians aren't totally sure. But one of the leading ladies of Philadelphia, possible paramour of George Washington, asks Benjamin Franklin at her house or on the steps somewhere, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy right after the Constitutional Convention? And he says famously, a republic if you can keep it. This is something that a lot of us were raised with in graduate school, but I don't really think we think that much about it. Maybe you guys do. In my world of like social psychology, relationship science, we don't think much about this question, but I don't really know the answer. And there was some follow-up discussion, but it doesn't really give the answer. What does it mean to point at an individual citizen and say, you've got a republic if you can keep it? Like, what are you supposed to do? So it's not clear what he meant, right? So here's my take, and this will sound familiar. My take is what Franklin meant is you're welcome to ask for a republic. It's a cool thing to ask for. You can ask for whatever you want, but there are consequences of those asks. Just as in a marriage, you're welcome to ask a lot or a little of your marriage, but if you're going to ask a lot, you probably want to be investing enough in the relationship that it can plausibly deliver the things that you're asking of it. Similarly, with a political system, you want a republic? Yeah, it's great. It's way better than, I don't know, a kingdom, right? Let's do it. You know, I don't want a tyrant. I'd rather have you know, this sort of electoral system. What are the responsibilities of the citizen? So what can individual citizens do to build and sustain a political system that Lincoln later characterized as government of, by, and for the people? So one possible answer, again, if I went around the room, maybe there'd be a million answers, but one possible answer comes from Washington's farewell, not the part of the farewell that was made famous by Lin-Manuel Miranda, but certainly a famous part of it. He says, we really need to avoid extreme partisanship. And here he's like literally holding a crystal ball, so far as I can tell, while he and Hamilton are writing this thing. What is the problem with factionalism or extreme partisanship? Well, let's focus on three. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. Hello. Unfounded jealousies, what is it? It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one party against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection, and it opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government through the channels of party passions. And if you just read the underlying text, it's literally like he was looking at the news over the last several years. So this was a thesis in 1796 when he offered his address, but now there's a lot of social science on this. Again, I don't think I need to do too much in this room to make the case, but you could argue that Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's book, How Democracies Die, is arguably like testing the Washington thesis, the farewell address thesis that really extreme factionalism is a problem. And they explore this question, you know, in a comparative international sense, like when and how do democracies die? And they argue that we have this schema in our heads of basically military coups, right? So this was true of Pinochet in 1973, but in general, they say that's not what happens, at least not within the last 50 years. That's not really the way democracies die. Democracies die by the steady erosion of fundamental norms that the society holds, right? Not the military leaders or even the politicians exactly, but that there's a tolerance for the erosion of these norms. What are the norms? Number one, mutual toleration, where you view opposing partisans as legitimate opposition rather than existential enemies. To the degree that that norm starts to erode, your democracy is in danger. Norm number two, according to these guys. Norm number two, forbearance. Adopting the view that just because you have the power to do something doesn't mean that you should. And again, I'm sure in this room, we don't have to talk about how much isn't in the Constitution. The Constitution can't legislate everything, right? And so, for example, court packing, gerrymandering, like arbitrary filibustering, corrupt pardons, these are all things that you can do. They're constitutional. And once you see the erosion of these norms, your democracy is in threat. Now, I'm not going to make the case that these guys make, and I think you could make for yourself, that we've seen steady erosion in these norms. By the way, I'm not going to get into like who's worse today. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but we've seen plenty of erosion of these norms across the political spectrum. Okay, Washington said something else that is relevant for our discussion today. He says, this is all the stuff that I showed you before, where he's holding his crystal ball, but he also says this, and there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage extreme partisanship. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. He says something radical here that sort of gets buried in there. He says this, who's responsible? Who's supposed to keep factionalism at bay? We are. We, the people, are supposed to do it. It's our job. It's our responsibility. So let me just draw a conclusion for part one of this talk, which is that living in a republic comes with responsibilities, just like trying to ask a lot of your marriage comes with some responsibilities to put the marriage in a place where it can deliver those things. One responsibility is adherence to and enforcement of toleration and forbearance, especially on our own side, right? Catching the other side in hypocrisy, that's easy. Standing up to our own, much more difficult. Ultimate responsibility for upholding these norms resides with me, the people. That's the argument I made in part one of the talk. I'm hoping there's time at the end where you can quibble with any and all parts. But let me move on and talk about this concern that I have. I basically made this case that here we are, we're driving toward a cliff and there's no off-ramps, right? Like, okay, what is my case for that? Well, we are divided. I don't think I need to sell you guys on that, but it's been this room and Jamie, you in particular, who've really helped me to understand what is the nature of the division. So I'm not going to spend as much time on this as I would with rooms that are less familiar, but you can talk about ideological polarization and then something that sometimes gets called affective polarization or social polarization, what have you. But let's talk first about ideology. To what degree are we fighting over political ideals and policies? We think we are. There's no doubt that we are convinced that we're fighting over substance. To what degree are things getting like way more substantively diverse? Well, it sort of depends how you ask the question. You guys are familiar with this. So there's the consistency argument, and this suggests that we are. These are data from the Pew Research Center, but this isn't actually asking, are people diverging? This isn't actually asking, are the Americans getting more extreme in terms of their policy preferences? This is asking how consistent we are. This is asking whether there's one dimension underlying our beliefs, like left, right, or whatever, versus a lot of different dimensions. And I don't know, it's not totally self-evident to me why abortion policy should correlate at 1.0 with environmental policy, but luckily and heroically it does. It's not 1.0, but somehow, and honestly, I feel cynical about it. You're not going to like it, but I think we basically know what team we're on, and we find out what things we're supposed to support, and then we support those things. So that has happened, there's no doubt. But there's also like divergence, which is like, are we getting bimodal? It's like, well, now the policy preferences look like this. No, there's no evidence for it at all. I'll spare the more detailed summary of it, only to say, if you want to quibble, feel free to take it up with Jamie. So, and also, if you buy my marriage book, you can find a great discussion of these issues. So there's a second type of polarization, and I don't really mean polarization because that's the wrong word, a second type of partisanship, let's say. So we've called this political sectarianism. If there's time, we can go through the whole discussion about how we settled on that term. We're actually kind of happy with it in the end. But this is the science paper that Jamie talked about. This is Jamie smiling at us and basically bestowing his blessing on the paper. He was fundamentally every bit along the way, like the two of us, first and last author, wrote this. But you'll notice that we have several other friends here. Mary was a co-author on that. Cindy was a co-author. This is like a team of top people from across 6 social sciences. This was on the shelves when people went to the polls in 2020. Then we argued that there's the second type, like non-ideological, the more social type, that has 3 elements. We said it has othering, and now we've been creating a scale. It includes items like, no matter how hard I try, I can't see the world the way Republicans do. It has aversion, so like my feelings toward Republicans are negative. And it has moralization. By the way, we only kept items that basically had means sort of near the midpoint and plenty of distributional properties. It turns out Republicans are evil, no problem. You can get a lot of agreement on that and plenty of distributional qualities. This isn't something people are unwilling to admit to. So this is, I think, what there is going on. So I don't think there's much evidence that there's diversion in terms of, or divergence in terms of ideas and policy preferences, but there seems to be tremendous amount of dislike. So what's the evidence for that? This is a graph that you guys have seen a bunch of times. Turns out, and this is why I think polarization is one of the reasons why I think polarization is a misnomer. We don't like our side anymore. It's not like we're like, hey, our side's even better than people thought in 1970. We just hate the other side. It used to be like kind of tepid. You always liked your side more than the other side, but our side stayed in the 70 to 75 range, but you go from something like 50 to something like 20, right? And Jamie had this insight that you can actually do something kind of interesting, which is you can compare the extent to which you favor your side over the extent to which you disfavor the other side relative to the exact neutral point of the scale. And so we also included this graph. And it is, I think, sobering, right? And I call this the triumph of hate, right? At some point, it was like, well, we like our own side. The other side, we don't feel great about it. But now, even though we don't like our side anymore, we heroically hate the other side enough that it has triumphed over the love that we have for our own side. And, we're not the first to make arguments like this. This is a famous paper from Abramowitz and Webster, who argue that negative partisanship is really what drives political behavior these days, voting behavior and so forth. It's not really how much you like your side, it's how much you hate the other side. And like my guess is that a lot of you have some empathy with like, oh, I hate, let's just imagine you're lefties, Donald Trump enough that I'll do anything to keep that guy out of office. Let me just say, I have some sympathy to that perspective. But here's like another point from the Abramowitz and Webster paper is that basically it's like our party is the only thing that matters. Like people used to talk about politics being local. So here we have, again, you might be familiar with this, is the correlation between Democratic share of the House vote and Democratic share of the presidential vote. These are in contested districts. And it was always the case that there was a positive correlation. If you preferred the Democratic House candidate, you were more likely to vote for the Democrat for president and vice versa. But there used to be some, like, this guy's an asshole, or yeah, but the local issues matter to me. But it's like almost evaporated. Like there's almost no difference anymore between the national and the local. And by the way, some of you guys might be familiar with this. I went ahead and tracked down the data. I plotted the proportion of Trump's vote share in 2016, and I've just plotted it here from the least Trumpy county to the most Trumpy county, 3,100, whatever it is. And again, you guys have seen a lot of this stuff. There's like what Latino voters or Latinx voters were doing in Florida or in South Texas. There's been a lot of significant differences. Anybody have a guess what the correlation was between his vote share in 2016 and 2020. Like, obviously it's north of 0.5, but 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, 0.95. Anybody want to guess? 0.95, anybody have a different guess? Everybody thinks that's about right? 0.99. By the way, I just want to underscore, I don't really have time to do this, but here I go. What a crazy 4 years. There was like an impeachment. I like it. It's like this is it. After all of the Durm and Strom and Dern, help me, somebody with like language skills. What is that phrase, that German phrase? Storm and stress. That sounds like English, man. Suspiciously like, oh, and Drang. Okay. What the hell? So for example, and by the way, COVID happened in this time, impeachment happened in this time. Like, consider, for example, in 1932, we crushed the incumbent. There was a 35-point swing from 1928 to 1932 because of the Great Depression. Was the Great Depression bigger than like COVID mismanagement and the like? Maybe, but like a 2% shift away from Trump as opposed to a 35% shift away from Hoover. So anyway, here's the summary of part 2. There isn't really much increase in how much we disagree. But there's a vast increase in political sectarianism, really how much we hate the other side, and party über alles. Social identity, really it's it. That's basically what matters. I know you're tempted to quibble. I'd love to hear your quibbles. This is my reading of the evidence. Okay, and by the way, I'm not saying literally 0 is due to like actual disagreement. I'm saying it is almost sufficient to explain the data to know what party a person belongs to. Okay, why not violence? Or in other words, the case for violence. Ready? I can't read what that says. Oh yeah, the knife's edge. Okay, so here's something else. Again, I didn't know any of this stuff a few years ago, but I've learned a lot about this. So this is, again, these are my, not my data, but I downloaded these. This is my graph. So you plot the presidential popular vote percentage over the last century. All over the place, right? So here's Biden. He won by 4.5%. Like I said, Hillary won by about 2.5%. So we saw a 2-point shift. So in terms of vote share. So you can consider, like, is that a big or a little difference? Well, let's consider it in a historic context. So these are the ones since 2000, so in the new century. And you can see that one time there was an electoral situation that had a vote, what is it, presidential margin that was bigger. But you guys remember Obama in 2008. But what's wild to me, and I just didn't know this stuff, right? I've been an adult basically only in this century. And so I learned that if you go back to the 19th century, you see this, again, if we go back 100 years, and Biden margins were, 80% of them were larger than Biden, and the average margin was 16%. Anybody think we're going to see 16% in our lifetimes? I'm actually curious about that. You guys know more about this stuff. Are we going to see a 16% presidential win in our lifetimes? Who says yes? Who says probably no? And who's too lame even to try? That's what we like to hear. Okay, so this is the regression line, right? And this is part of the problem. This is what I mean by a knife's edge. One of the major reasons why we hate each other this much and why we engage in such chicanery in order to win is because power hangs in every single election. That wasn't the case for 50 years. Democrats kind of had it. And there's been a lot of good research. One of my favorites is insecure majorities. It's like when things are that close, that's when you stop fighting about ideas and you really just try to like stain the other side. Now, the second part, so it's not only that every election is hanging on a knife's edge, there's also the narratives that we tell ourselves about what's going on. So this is Braver Angels. If the wrong candidate wins the election, America will not recover. This is just a week or two before the election. 70% of Americans and 70 to 80%, probably about 75% on average, of partisans, people who identify as Democrats and Republicans, believe this. Again, I'm building to a case for like, why not violence, right? Like this is what hangs in the balance. And how about this? This is Moe Brooks. This is the January 6th thing we've heard so much about. This is the one, it's too obvious to present Trump, but this is the one where he said, if you don't fight like hell, you're not gonna have a country anymore. Well, just before him was Moe Brooks riling up the crowd. And here's what he said. Today, Republicans, senators, and congressmen will either vote to turn America into a godless, immoral, dictatorial, oppressed, and socialist nation on the decline, or they will join us and they will fight and vote against voter fraud and election theft and vote for keeping America great. Anybody really want to judge somebody who storms the Capitol if you believe this? Are we willing to condemn them, or are we going to call them patriots? They think they're patriots. How about this? It's like, okay, yeah, but we all know that like the right is full of crazy mother effers. If you weren't here, I could have gone all in on that, Morty. Okay, so I guess you're sort of a lame duck at this point. Right? So, okay, so Rebecca Solnit, one of the, like, a leading light on the left, a very strong sort of compelling lefty thinker. This is an article published shortly after the election in 2020, and she says, like, I'm not meeting Nazis halfway. Why is it so hard for Democrats to act like they actually won? When Trump won the 2016 election, this is her opening. While losing the popular vote, the New York Times seemed obsessed with running features about what Trump voters were feeling and thinking. These pieces treated them, Trump voters, as both an exotic species and people it was our job to understand, understand being that word that means both comprehend and to grant some sort of indulgence to. Appeasement didn't work in the 1930s and it won't work now. Let me ask you, if we are literally fighting essentially Nazis, lest you miss it, Nazis, and she's not talking about Charlottesville. She's talking about, let me drive it home for you, Trump voters, right? I don't know, like, am I that opposed to taking up arms, to gerrymandering people, to suppressing their vote? I'm pretty open-minded, honestly. I have to admit, I'm open-minded to the idea that if these are the stakes, that we might have to pull some radical stuff. Why not violence? Control of the government is up for grabs every election cycle. The threat of electoral defeat feels existential. And if those are the stakes, anti-democratic behavior and violence may be quite rational. By the way, an argument that I didn't make here in the interest of time, I'll just do it briefly right now, is it's not only that everything hangs on a knife's edge every election cycle, which is true, and the story that we tell ourselves about what electoral defeat means are, the stories are existential, but there's another one, which is if the other side wins, it will be through cheating, and this is the last time we're gonna have a chance to compete on anything even close to a level playing field. By the way, read Charles Blow's New York Times piece from just this morning, right? But all the time you're seeing these arguments, especially on the left, but you see them on the right too. I know it's weird for those of us who only read lefty media to know how parallel a lot of these arguments are. But, I'm not actually arguing for violence because this isn't really the version of reality that I think makes sense. And here's the case that I'd like to make. We are fighting phantoms. And I'll talk a little bit about some of Jamie's work, some of our work. So remember this slide that I showed you earlier? I sort of glossed over something. There's something important in what Washington said that we don't focus as much on. Ill-founded jealousies, false alarms. He's kind of right that if they aren't ill-founded, if you really are fighting Nazis, then you probably have to break some sort of democratic norms because the stakes are that high. The question is, are we right? So here is an early study in this space, one of the earliest I can find. This is assistance for an at-fault person in need. So the way this study is set up, imagine that you're a participant. You read about 3 individuals who have put themselves into difficult circumstances. Somebody got AIDS because she had a lot of unprotected sex. Somebody lost his job because he's lazy, right? Like, what do we do in situations like that? And so what they do is they put you in the role of like a nonprofit who's like, how much monetary assistance should you provide? And it's like, no monetary assistance at all. And like all the monetary assistance, I forget what the endpoint was, but very, very little or no monetary assistance, a great deal of monetary assistance. This is self-report. This is what Democrats and Republicans say about people who have really gotten themselves into hardship, arguably through faults of their own. We find the effect you'd expect. Democrats think we should take care of those people more than Republicans should. What's interesting to consider is each side stereotypes of the other. So this is true. There is a meaningful difference between the left and the right in how we should treat those people. Perception from the OutParty. You get the effects in the right direction. That is, this is what Republicans think Democrats will say, 7.7. This is what Democrats think Republicans will say, 2.5. Fair enough. Effects in the same direction, but this one, the distortion is 4 times as large. And this is, again, sort of an aside, just because I don't know, maybe I can alienate somebody here, but is this bad? Like, what is the right amount of disagreement on this stuff? Like, honestly, I'd rather have one party be like, no, those people are responsible for what they did, and therefore they're not going to get a lot of assistance. And another party be like, can't we sort of take care of ourselves and social contract? Like, we should really, like, I don't know, this level of difference may not be more than ideal. It might be optimal, but it is not this. All right. This is, by the way, on this question, this is an aside for the talk, but I do like to show this. So this is a paper from 2020. PLOS1 paper, where they looked at across a bunch of nations, nationally representative samples across 8 issues that are putatively moral. And they asked, I'm not going to go into detail, but in brief, they asked the populations, is this not a moral issue, immoral, or morally acceptable? I think is how this works. And the point here is just like, okay, you can look across these things, but you can see the red and the blue lines. Those are for Democrats and Republicans in the US. And these other things are all like the world. Right? It's like these are things that in the world as it exists, not in some hypothetical universe, but in the world as it exists, in those nations that happen to have big nationally representative surveys. And what you can see here is, I don't know, this is the conclusion, right? That we are, Democrats and Republicans are more similar across these 8 issues than 70% of the cross-national comparisons. I don't know what to make of that. I can tell you like my bias. My bias is to say, that doesn't seem that huge. But you might disagree. You might easily say, no, like that's still huge. But it would be nice if we had some metric of saying like what the right amount of disagreement is. It certainly isn't 0. All right, I digress. We've done some research on this. This is some research on basic human values. Now, why is it that we've been so interested in this topic? Well, basic human values are kind of big, and we think it's what's driving a lot of our contempt for the other side. So for example, this is again, just before the 2020 election, only about 1 in 5 Trump and Biden supporters say they share the same core American values. So let's look at these. So you have to choose, right? You're a Democrat, you have to choose these, or a Republican, whatever. Not only do we have different priorities when it comes to politics, but we fundamentally disagree about core American values. Something like 80% of people agree with that side, versus something like 20% who agree with, we have different priorities when it comes to politics, but we share a fundamental commitment to the same core American values. So we are pretty convinced on the whole that the people on the other side are, in terms of values, fundamentally different from us. Is that true? Well, this is a project I'm doing in collaboration with Amy Gordon, Maria Luciani, and Catherine Garton. And we're looking at this idea of basic human values. I know there's a little bit of research on this in the political science space. I think our approach is pretty different. But Shalom Schwartz argues that if you look internationally, there's basically 10 things that people value, and this is what they are. I'm not enough of an international psychology expert to know whether these are the 10. I'm happy to trust him. This is by far the most influential theory in the space. People want some sort of power and influence. They care about achievement. They care about hedonism, like having some pleasure in their life, stimulation, self-direction, universalism, benevolence, tradition, conformity, and security. And again, to the degree that there's been any research on this for Democrats and Republicans, you get the sort of effects you expect that, universalism, and I'm the one who added these images, right? But universalism, that's like a more lefty thing than a righty thing. Tradition is more of a righty thing than a lefty thing. That's all true, right? And in fact, we replicate that effect. So here we have the Selfreport values. This is large samples of Democrats, Republicans reporting on the extent to which these are things that you value. I've plotted them from low to high in terms of what Democrats prioritize. This is, as you can see, and the full scale goes from 1 to 8. So this is the full range. So, okay, this is it. They value benevolence and self-direction. They don't value power and conformity that much. What about Republicans? How do they compare? How are they similar? How are they different? Well, there are noticeable differences here. Conformity and tradition, Republicans clearly care more than Democrats do. Universalism, yet again in our sample, Democrats care more than Republicans. What's the correlation? Let's say we decide to look not at the trees, but at the forest. Strong, positive correlation. What is a fair interpretation? I believe it to be there are some differences if you focus on this tree or that tree. But if you focus on the forest, Democrats and Republicans have the same, generally the same values about the things that Schwartz et al. Say are like the big international values that people care across all cultures. But what happens when you project? That is, what happens when you ask people, not just what do you value, what does the other side value? So here I have just reproduced the line. This is the blue line here, right? So this is what Democrats actually value. This red line I'm about to show you is what do Democrats think Republicans value? This is truly heroic. Not only do they not see how much they disagree, this doesn't go from a 0.5 down to a 0.25 or even a 0.5 down to a 0. These same people who basically have the same values heroically believe that they are exact opposites in terms of what they value. And basically the same story when you look at Republican trajectories. There's no meaningful difference between this -0.6 and -0.7. Okay, a third example, and here's a, oh no, sorry, this is from that same study. By the way, and I think this is important. In this study, actual value divergence, like we can look, the extent to which your actual values diverge from the mean member of the other party, was largely unrelated to hatred for the opposing partisans. So like the extent to which I value those things, you do the same sort of profile correlation with what is the average Republican value, no correlation between how much I overlap with you and how much I like or dislike you, but massive correlation with perceived value divergence, that is distortion. That is the degree to which my values diverge from what I think you value falsely, then there's this huge effect, huge link to hatred. Here is a little bit of a Druckmann, because you can't really have a talk in this space without a healthy dose. So this is OutParty political positions. This is a 2022 paper in the Journal of Politics. So this is reality. So you can ask people, like, you know, this is oversimplifying your methods a little bit, but you can ask people the extent to which people have moderate versus extremist political positions. And what people self-report is that they tend to be moderates, they tend not to be extremists, but the perceptions, what is the other side like? Even though there are in fact more moderates than extremists, according to their own reports, we heroically believe that the other side is three times more likely to be extreme than moderate, right? And this same paper also looks at out-party affect, right? And this is interesting. So if you are somebody who is in a condition where you're told these other people, they're extreme and they talk about politics all the time, or they're moderate in their positions and they don't like to talk about politics very much, turns out you really dislike the people a lot more that are extreme partisans on the other side and talk about politics all the time, rather than if they're moderate partisans and don't talk about politics much. We're not surprised by that. The question is, what happens in the default condition, right? The condition that the rest of us are always studying, which is, okay, what is a Republican like? What is a Democrat like? And you're not given information about what their extremity is or how frequently they talk about this stuff. Well, you do see something a little bit in the middle, right? You do see that there's like not quite as much dislike as the extreme partisan, but you can see it's a whole lot closer to this than it is to the moderate partisan, which suggests that what's actually happening when we're trying to think about what the other side's like, it's like how much do you like or dislike Republicans? You're thinking of the people who stormed the Capitol and thinking they're representative. I'm exaggerating, but not much. By the way, so this we really don't know, we're fighting phantoms. I want to revisit this Solnit piece. These pieces, these New York Times pieces, treated Trump voters both as an exotic species and people it was our job to understand. She's outraged by this. I mean, the piece is an outraged piece. If the data that we just showed are right, this idea that we can just trust our judgment about what the other side is like is a little bit problematic. Again, I welcome critiques of that. Hopefully we'll have some time to talk about it. So this is part 4, fighting phantoms, the summary. Our perceptions of opposing partisans are distorted, not a little bit, right? Like if you're somebody who's like, well, I'd like to do an effect that I'd like to study something that is both reliable and freaking huge in terms of effect size, I recommend this, these sort of partisan distortions. The distortions, but not the reality, drive our hatred. That is the degree to which we are deluded predicts our hatred. The degree to which we are accurate, uncorrelated. The distortions are due in part to faulty stereotypes. That is, we think every Republican's invading the Capitol. And by the way, this is just an aside, we might have time for it. It's not clear to me, and so far as I can tell, it is not clear to anybody, that the level of actual disagreement between opposing partisans today is, on average, larger than ideal. We've been trying to think about how to study this question. I think we are going to study this, but it is not an easy tractable question. And to the best of our lit review, nobody has seriously asked it in an empirical way. All right, good. I have left us some time. Where from here? So this is something I showed you earlier. I don't need to revisit all this. There are others, like civil war is one, right? Like there's a whole bunch of possibilities. So, like how about non-civil war? Or how about like peaceful separation? Like I'm open to that. If somebody can figure out how to move San Francisco to like New York, then maybe we can do it. The last thing I want to leave us with, and this was an early title for this talk, is the cavalry is not coming. And I actually removed this. Turns out I did have time, but I removed this as part of the presentation where I talk about what are the solutions. For the record, I'll go into it a little bit because I do have a little bit of time. I think there are many, many sources of blame for how we started down this road of driving off a cliff. I think, give it up to Newt Gingrich, give it up to social media, give it up to our voting rules. Like you could go on and on about this stuff. But although many entities are responsible for how we got here, I believe there to be only one entity that can viably fix it, and that is us. That is like we, the people, have to decide that the glorious, delicious loveliness of moral righteousness is not so valuable that it's worth putting our democracy at risk, which is, I think, what most of us are doing, or a lot of us are doing. And my reasoning here, why I think it's really going to be up to us and the solutions that people are proposing, structural fixes, can't we just fix social media? What about changing our voting laws? I don't think those are fixable because we, the people, are responsible for the incentive structures that people face. Twitter, Facebook, didn't try to polarize us. They tried to get us engaged, and that polarized us. Why? We've got to look in the mirror for that. There's all sorts of, you can imagine gerrymandering commissions, but by and large, people would rather win than have a fair map. Okay. The most important political office is that of the private citizen. This is Louis Brandeis. It's a very powerful observation to me. And so my conclusion is, and this is again, an opinion piece more than anything, democracy asks that we fight fiercely for our ideals and policy preferences, but also against sectarianism-induced blindness. Okay, plenty of time for conversation. Thank you.